Okay. Let's start with this thought. Let's start with the following thought. Ratzei v'shev, right? Ratzei v'shev. You know what Ratzei v'shev means?
The will of something?
Ratzei v'shev means running back and forth, forward and backwards. The concept of Ratzei v'shev, right, philosophically, means movement. Something is moving. It's Ratzei v'shev.
Probably. Is it possible you turn on your camera and I want to see your face?
Oh, I apologize. I'm sorry. I'm just a bit of a Very good. Here I am. Yineni. Okay, the meaning of Ratzei v'shev means moving forwards and backwards. That's the simple translation of the word. That means running. Shev means settling. So when you speak about Ratzei v'shev, philosophically, the first thing that you think of, at least that's how my brain works, is you think of life. Right? The sign of a living thing is motion. The difference between something which is alive and which is something which is not alive is movement. And Ratzei v'shev, something which is in a state of motion, is alive. Now we can talk about this because Hashem is alive and he's not in motion, so clearly there's a different concept of life. But in convention, that's how we understand it. The meaning of Ratzei v'shev means motion, movement, and movement means the sign of life. Now the question is why? Why is Ratzei v'shev a sign of life? Why is the proof that something is living that it's in a state of motion? And again, I'm sure there's a lot of explanations. But the explanation that Chassidus gives for Ratzei v'shev is for something to be alive, it requires two things minimally. For something to be alive, you have to have a minimum of two things. Number one, a self-identity. For something to be able to say I, for something to be living as a self-contained entity, it has to have a self-identity, right? If you studied biology, you know that the sign of every living creature, not just a creature living on the land, but even a creature living in the water, and even the most, jellyfish-like creatures that are virtually see-through and they're almost water, is a wall that separates them from their environment, right? The sign of a living thing is an envelope, is a machitza that separates inside from outside. So for something to be living, it has to have a distinct self-identity separate from its environment. On the other hand, for something to be living, it has to be attached to a source of life. In other words, we don't think of life only in biological terms, in physical terms. We think of life in spiritual terms, in terms of a soul, in terms of an neshama. For something to be living, it has to have a connection to something which is not just biological matter, but a neshama, which is the real reason why the biological matter has the order, has the organization that it has. And that's what the Ratzu comes in. The Ratzu means I'm going back to God. So the sign of a living thing, again, with the exception of Hashem himself, Hashem is alive, but he has different rules. The sign of a living thing is motion. What are the two motions? Shaiv means I identify with me. Ratzei means I'm connecting to my source. I connect to my source to be alive. I identify with myself to be distinctly alive. So there's a concept in Hasidus, which is used often, a lot, that the meaning of a living thing is Ratzei. It's running back and forth. It's running towards Hashem to renew its life. It's running towards its body to have a self-identity. And in Yiddishkeit, we talk about Ratzei v'shev in 1,000 contexts. Okay, for example, we would say that Tishrei is Ratzei, the rest of the year is Shoiv. Tishrei, we're running to Hashem, the rest of the year we're living our life. We would say every day, the time that we daven and learn is Ratzei, the time that we go out to work and play is Shoiv. In this Maimer, we're saying it in a finer level. And we would say, first of all, that the Ratzei v'shev is Shema and Shemon Esrei. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which is running towards Hashem, announcing that Hashem is real. That's Ratzei. Shmoyne Esrei, ironically, which is the idea of bringing all the barachas of Hashem into my life, is Sheiv. Well, yesterday we had a new concept of Ratzei v'Sheiv. In addition to all the former concepts of Ratzei v'Sheiv, we had a new concept of Ratzei v'Sheiv. The first pasha of Kriyas Shema is Ratzei, and the second pasha of Kriyas Shema is Shuv. Why? What did we learn yesterday? Yesterday we learned that the first pasha of Kriyas Shema is connected to Gvura. What's Gvura? Fire. What's fire going up? What's the second pasha of Kriyas Shema? It's connected to Chesed. What's Chesed? Chesed is water. What's the concept of water that it brings down? So the ideas of Ratzei v'Sheiv have been narrowed more and more. Okay? So I'm just going to go through my list quickly one more time. You could say that Elul and Tishrei is Ratzei, the whole year is Sheiv. You could say the time that we daven and learn is Ratzei, when we go work and play is Sheiv. You could say that Kriyas Shema is Ratzei and Shmoneh Esrei is Sheiv. Now we're saying that the first pasha of Kriyas Shema is Mab, which is 42, which is the gematria of Gevura, and I explained yesterday why 42 is connected to Gevura. That's Ratzei, fire, running towards Hashem. The second pasha of Kriyas Shema, V'hayim Shamaya, which has Ab, 72 words, which is gematria Chesed. This is Sheiv, you're bringing the Eibishter into your life. This has been, so to speak, the dance. Right? This has been the duality that we've been learning about in the last bunch of classes. Right? We're talking about having a special relationship with Hashem. In having a special relationship with Hashem, there's two priorities: to have the relationship and to live the relationship. So Shema is having the relationship, Shmoneh Esrei is living the relationship. The first pasha of Kriyas Shema is having the relationship. The second pasha of Kriyas Shema is living the relationship. And in a broader sense, going to shul in the morning, davening and learning is having the relationship, and bringing that relationship into my work and my play is living the relationship, and so forth and so on. This is a summary, a very, very brief summary, a 3-minute summary or a 5-minute summary of what we've been learning. Now, I'm on page 240, and I know you don't have a book, but I'm talking to more than one group of people, so I'm gonna.
I actually found one in my house.
Cool.
It doesn't help if it's a keyboard.
Okay, it's page 240. You can open up the book and let the words dance in front of you. 8 lines from the top of the page, where it says V'ha'inyan. And now the Tzemach Tzedek, there's a big, long discussion that the Tzemach Tzedek has here, which goes on for like a page and a half. It's quite involved. I'm going to have to figure out how I'm going to do this, how I'm going to learn this with you, but it's a very, very involved discussion about the idea of Yesh Me'ayin, okay? Okay, I'll start to read. I'll let the Maimon lead me. In order to explain the idea that we learned yesterday, that the first pasha of Kriyas Shema is Gevura, or running towards Hashem, Ratzei. The second pasha of Kriyas Shema is Chesed, or Shoy, which is bringing Hashem into my life. Yuvan behegde, it will be understood by prefacing Mitchila first, K'tzas, a small clarification of Inyan Yesh Me'ayin, the idea of Yesh Me'ayin. Okay, so now we got to talk candidly. Turn your sound on. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Okay? Are you familiar with the idea of ex nihilo?
Idea of what?
Ex nihilo. Ex nihilo is Latin for after nothing. Acharei ha'heder. I guess that's a negative. The words yesh miyesh and yesh me'ayin mean anything to you? The Hebrew words, something from something and something from nothing, do they mean anything to you?
Creation of world.
My question is, have you learned about them in Hasidus? That's what I'm really asking.
No.
No. Okay, so I'm going to start from the very, very, very beginning. Okay. This is my classic story. This is how I start this conversation. And like I said, between today, tomorrow there's no class. Between today and Sunday, I have to figure out It's a long, long, long discussion at Yesh Mayayin. And to be very honest, I don't want to put yourself to sleep, and I don't put myself to sleep. So I'll figure out how I'm going to proceed. I may actually allow myself just to overview it and to move straight to the point. In other words, we're going to spend like a perek and a half on Yesh Mayayin, and then we're going to get back to Krishma. I'm not sure I want to spend 4 weeks on Yesh Mayayin. I may want to sort of tell you what's written here and then move to the next discussion on davening and skip the fancy philosophy for fancy schmancy people. Okay, let me tell you my story. Okay, this is my classic story. Okay, this is the story that I always tell. I was on Shlichus in California in Earl Chabad in 1985, in 1986, and 1987. I was on Shlichus. We went in the Shlichus started in the summertime and it lasted for 2 years till the summertime. In those days, it was different than today. I don't know if you know Los Angeles, but now they have 20 shluchim. They have 10 shluchim for the Beis HaMedrash and 10 shluchim for the Masifta. It's a whole production. When we were there were 10 of us. And every single Shabbos, each one of the shluchim went and he spoke Chassidus in a shul. Every single Shabbos, each one of the shluchim went and they spoke Chassidus in a shul. Now, there were not 10 shuls in Los Angeles that were interested in having a Lubavitcher Bacha come and speak every week. In other words, there were larger, more populous shuls, there were more prominent shuls. Some of them let us come once a year, some let us come twice a year, some let us come 4 times a year, some let us come once a month. And rarely was there a shul that had, more than 1 million mitzumtzim that allowed us to come every week. So if there were 10 of us going to speak in shuls every single Shabbos, we ended up speaking in what we used to call in the olden days museums. You know what a museum is? A gigantic, gorgeous Orthodox shul with stained windows and oak benches and beautiful carpeted aisles and a beautiful bimah and a large stage and an Aron Kodesh. And the room was empty. The youngest member in the shul was 72. The oldest member in the shul was 88. And when I came Mincha Ma'ariv to make my speech, I was the 10th man. You understand? So I would say that out of 10 of us, probably 4 or 5 or 6 of us every Shabbos spoken in a shul that was basically on its last leg. And they were very happy to have us. In many cases, they needed us for a minute. So for a long time, I would speak every single Shabbos in the same shul. It was called Etz Jacob, Congregation Etz Jacob. I don't know what's going on there now. It was on Fairfax and 3rd Avenue, a large shul. The rabbi of that congregation was an old man whose name was Rabbi Katz. Rabbi Katz was actually a very, very big Talmid Chacham. He was a Slabodka Talmid from before the war. His first name was Shmuel Katz. He used to call himself Rabbi Sam Katz. He had been in LA since after the war. And he was a Litvak, a Litvish Yid, what we would call a Misnagid. He learned in the best Litvish yeshivas, but he loved Chabad. He loved the Mesiras Nefesh of the Shluchim. He absolutely adored the Shluchim. Rabbi Katz. Rabbi Katz was too old to walk the shul. So every single Shabbos, I would come to Rabbi Katz's shul. He was not there. He would come only during the week. He couldn't walk. His wife had to drive him to shul. And I would get up in this gigantic room and make a speech. If I had read the phone book, nobody would have known the difference. I mean, there was a bunch of Alta Yidalach. You're talking now 35 years ago. And the Yidden were 75 and up. So they spoke Yiddish. A lot of them were Europeans. Some of them were Americans. But they were, shul Yidden, old people who went to shul. In the back of the shul, at the last row, on one side of the mechitza sat a man, on the opposite side of the mechitza sat a woman. They would come every week and they would sit the whole time and talk to each other. They were a young couple. They were probably in their 30s. What were they doing in Etz Jacob? They had a motorhome that they would park outside the shul every Friday. And that's how they Shabbos. They lived in this truck, in this trailer. Every Shabbos they would park their motorhome outside the shul and they would spend Shabbos. And every week I would come to the shul and speak. I had no idea who was listening to me. And like I told you before, I could have read the phone book. Nobody would have known the difference. I was talking into it this like people ask me, where did you learn public speaking? The answer is I learned it in the hallowed halls of the museums of Los Angeles. You had all of these buildings. They were empty of people, big, beautiful rooms, and we would get up and make speeches. I wasn't the only one. All my friends learned public speaking in this venue, in this way. Turns out that this Mr. and Mrs. who was sitting in the last row of the shul were listening to all my speeches, and they had a list of criticism. One day I come to shul, I must have been speaking in that shul for 4 months, a very long time. I come to shul, and there's a letter for me. I used to have the letter, and I once took it out to show somebody, and now I can't find it. A letter for me. The letter was 4 pages long, and in this letter they wrote 1,001 criticisms, all the things that I had said that they thought were wrong. And the letter was written very angry. They were really not happy about all the stupid things I said. I had no idea that anyone was listening. They were listening to every single word of every single one of my speeches, and whatever they didn't like, they would write a note, and then they gave me a letter of all their complaints. Now, this story happened 35 years ago. How old was I 35 years ago? I was 20, 21. I wasn't 22 yet. I obviously was not as knowledgeable as I am now. And I certainly was not, this is going to sound strange but true, I certainly was not as humble as I am now. I thought I knew everything. Or at least I thought I knew more than I know now. So when people criticize me, I didn't do well with criticism. B'chlal, I don't do well with criticism altogether. In general, most people have a hard time with criticism. People, by the way, who know how to be criticized are the luckiest people in the world, because if you can take criticism, you can grow. But if you become defensive, when someone tells you something you're doing wrong and you right away have to defend yourself, you don't learn anything. And I'm in the second category. I don't take criticism well. Then I for sure didn't take criticism well. Anyway, I tried to talk to them. They offered me for $1,000 a week. They would teach me Torah, and they'll teach it to me right, and they'll fix all my mistakes. That was the gist of the story. And there were a whole bunch of complaints. The truth of the matter is that when I think about it now, all their complaints had legitimacy. They were very angry, and they were acting weird, but the things that they wrote in that note, those 4 pages, criticizing the things I'd said, they all deserved answers. They really all deserved, they were good questions. Some of them were misconceptions on their part, and some of them were mistakes on my part, a human being. One of the many criticisms of those 4 pages was the following. I must have said in one of my speeches, God made the world out of nothing. Again, remember, I'm going into a shul week after week. The room is gigantic. He could have put 500 people in the room. There was a minyan mitzvah spread out all over the place. I don't know if they could even hear me. They were old people. The youngest, the Gabbai used to drive me home every week, was 72. He was the youngest guy in the shul. It was unfortunately a dying shul. Anyway, so I must have said in one of my speeches, God created the world out of nothing. So they wrote in this letter where they were criticizing all the things I had said, there's no such thing as nothing, not even in your head. Quote, that's the quote. There's no such thing as nothing, not even in your head. Okay, I had said God created the world out of nothing, and their response was, there's no such thing as nothing, not even in your head. Of course, at the time, I was insulted, and I didn't really have a constructive conversation with them. I tried to talk to them once. That was the end of it. And over the last 35 years, I've quoted this letter hundreds of times. I've made a lot of money off that letter. I've used that letter to make so many speeches. And whenever I teach certain subjects, I refer to that letter. So now, I thought about it, of course. And they're right, of course. When you say God made the world out of nothing, it sounds like from nothing he made something. So their argument was there's no such thing as nothing. You can't make something from nothing because there's no such thing. From a non-thing, you cannot create a thing. And they're absolutely right. They're really, really right. Now, that's how we say it. Hashem created the world out of nothing. First there was no world, and then there was a world. And because Hashem created the world, before there was no world, now the world, Hashem created the world out of nothing. But the truth of the matter is, they're 100% correct. They really are. God didn't create the world out of nothing. God created the world out of himself. Right? This is how the speech goes. If Hashem created the world out of nothing, I'm going to ask you a dumb question. Who's richer in the nothing department, you or God? Who has more nothing, you or him? Of course, that's a silly question, but you could argue that you are, I am, we are much richer in the nothing department than Hashem is. We have nothing. We have nothing. So if Hashem created the world out of nothing, we have as much nothing as he has, so we can for sure create the world out of nothing. And that's a silly way of putting it, The point is, Hashem doesn't create the world out of nothing. It's a figure of speech. When you say Hashem creates the world out of nothing, you really mean Hashem's created the world out of himself. V'haraya, you can't create a world. Even you, even though you live in South Florida and the weather is so beautiful, yeah, in Brooklyn for sure you can't create the world out of nothing. What's going on in Pomona, weiß ich nicht. But you cannot create something from nothing. Hashem, let me put it this way. The reason Hashem is able to create the world out of nothing, and we're not able to create the world out of nothing, is because Hashem is not creating the world out of nothing. Hashem is creating the world from himself. We don't have that ability. Okay? So if yesh me'ayin, the Hebrew words are yesh me'ayin. Yesh me'ayin. Yesh means something, me'ayin from nothing. Okay? Now in Latin, if you look in the Tanya, there's a Sansino Tanya that was printed in the 1970s that's written brilliantly, that no one can understand it, not because no one understands the Hebrew, but because nobody understands the English. Yeah? In the Sansino edition of the Tanya, the translation of the words yesh me'ayin is Latin. It's italicized X dash nihilo, Nihilo, X dash Nix nihilo. And ex nihilo, the way I understand it, means after nothing. Nihilo is from the word nihilism, nothing, and X means after. Ex nihilo means after nothing. So yesh me'ayin, which means Hashem, yesh means a thing. Me'ayin from nothing doesn't mean that Hashem created the world from nothing, because he can't create from nothing. It means he created after nothing. So now we have to understand, if Hashem created the world, and we, using colloquial speech, when we're not careful with our words, when we just speak simplistically, generally, we will assert, we will argue, Hashem is creating the world from nothing, but then when we think about it, we will realize, quote, there's no such thing as nothing, not even in your head. So Hashem is not creating the world out of nothing. Hashem is creating the world out of himself. So what is the meaning of that phrase? What does it mean? Hashem creates the world out of nothing. If he's not creating it out of nothing, he's creating it out of himself. And the answer is the following. Ex nihilo means after nothing. After nothing means a very, very simple thing. There's Hashem and there's a world. Period. How do you get from point A to point B? How do you go from Hashem to world? And the answer is we don't know how. It doesn't make any sense. And that's why we call it yesh me'ayin. We call it something from nothing, not because Hashem creates the world from nothing. Because Hashem doesn't create the world from nothing. Hashem creates the world from himself. We call creation, Hashem creates the world from nothing because a minute before it was in a state of nothing, it was Hashem. A minute after it's in a state of something, it's world. And we can't retrace our steps. We can't see how it happened. Okay, and I'm going to give you again, Meir Zev has heard this to me 100 times already. Right? This is my standard way of explaining it. Okay? Yesh me'ayin, which literally means that Hashem created the world me'ayin, from nothing, is now not, it's not being translated. Hashem created the world from nothing. It's Hashem created the world from himself. But he created the world from himself in such a way that first it was nothing, and then it was something, and you don't see how you journeyed from the state of nothing to the state of something, and that's why it's called something from nothing. So here goes my next standard speech. In other words, I'm pulling this out of my regular, I have a whole list of pre-recorded speeches. I'm giving you another one, okay? In modern science, right, the new physics, there's an expression, which you know. The expression is a quantum leap, right? There's a whole science, there's a whole field of microscience that's called the study of quantum. Quantum, I don't understand it entirely. I don't understand it very well at all, okay? But the expression, the quantum leap, we know, right? Where is the expression, the quantum leap, used? The expression quantum leap is used when they talk about matter and energy, physically. Right? One of the great chedushim of Einstein was that if you can speed up matter, if you can make things, if you make a rock move at 196,000 miles per second, it'll become energy. if you can slow energy down to the point that it's not moving at all, it'll become matter. There's a relativism, right? That's called relativity. Matter and energy are the same thing. A particle and a wave are the same thing. It's two forms of the same thing. What is the meaning of quantum leap? Quantum leap is you're looking at something, you through a microscope or through an indirect means. In one window, you're looking at it and it's a piece, it's a particle. In another window, you're looking at the very, very same thing. It's not a particle, it's a wave. It's energy, yeah? It goes from being a particle to being a wave, from being a wave to being a particle, being a physical thing to being energy, from an energy to being a physical thing. But it doesn't happen slowly. It's not like it slowly changes from being matter to becoming energy. It slowly changes from being energy to becoming matter. It's called a quantum leap. It jumps. Either it's in this condition or it's in this condition. It can't be in both conditions at the same time, although that's another story, yeah? And the way it changes from this condition to this condition is called a leap. It jumps. Because it doesn't happen in steps. It doesn't happen in increments. So what is the meaning of the phrase quantum leap? What is the taich of the words in English, a quantum leap? And by the way, in Maimonides Chasidus, they speak in Hebrew, they use the word dilog. The same exact word. When they want to describe creation, they call it dilog. A leap, jump. First your ayin, then your yesh. You cannot trace the steps from the ayin state to the yesh state. It's called dilog, called the jump. Okay? And the meaning of quantum leap is a very simple thing. And again, you know these things intuitively. You just don't know that you know these things. I'm just going to talk them through for you, okay? How do you get from the number 1 to the number 2? If I'm at point A, I'm on First Street. I want to get to Second Street. How am I going to get there? The answer, of course, is I have to pass through 1.5. Between 1 and 2, there's 1.5. How do I get to 1.5? The answer is you have to pass through 1.25. How do I get to 1.25? You have to pass by 1.125. How do you pass by from 1 to 1.125? You have to pass by 1 to 1.16. Right? The mathematician once asked me that every time you're moving, you're traveling through an infinity because you can always break it down into smaller and smaller numbers. So how do you get from point A to point B? It's a whole math. Okay? But that's how things work. If I want to go from one whole number to another whole number, from the number 1 to the number 2, I have to pass by 1.5. To get from 1 to 1.5, I have to pass through 1.25. If I want to get from 1 to 1.25, I have to pass through 1.125, etc., etc., etc. You get the point, yeah? Could I go from 1 to 2 and not pass by 1.5? Can I get from point A to point B and not pass through the interim steps in the middle? That's called a quantum leap. Quantum leap means I'm jumping from one whole number to another whole number, and I'm not passing through the steps in the middle. If I go from 1 and I come to 2, and I didn't pass by 1.5 in between, that's called the quantum leap. Quantum leap means I jumped a complete number without going through the incremental steps that are between 1 and 2. Okay? That is the mashal for Yesh Me'ayin. When you say Hashem created the world out of nothing, and then you say, wait a minute, there's no such thing as nothing. There's no such thing as nothing, not even in your head. That's how the story goes, right? This couple said to Rabbi Paltiel in 1986 or 87, there's no such thing as nothing, not even in your head. And I've been bouncing around that guilt ever since, this feeling of inadequacy for the last 35 years or so, 34 years, whatever number of years it's been since I was in that shul. But they're right. Hashem didn't create the world from nothing. Hashem created the world from himself. So if Hashem created the world from himself, why do we say he created it from nothing? And the answer is not he created it from nothing. He created it in a way that looks like from nothing. What does it mean he created it in a way that it looks like from nothing? First it's Hashem, then it's world. How do you go from Hashem to world? What are the steps? What are the steps? Halfway Hashem and halfway world, 3/4 Hashem and 1/4 world, 3/4 world and 1/4 Hashem. What are the steps? And there aren't any steps. There aren't any steps. The instant before, the point before, I don't even know if you could use the word time. The point before it was ayin, the point before it was God, the point after it's yesh, and the meaning of the word yesh means something which exists, someone that has some kind of a sense of independency, some kind of a sense of separateness, and because you go from the ayin state to the yesh state in what's called dilug, called a leap, you jump from one condition to another condition, and you don't gradually pass through point A to point B to point C to point D to point D until you slowly come to the new step, it's called Yesh Me'ayin. In other words, there's two ways to see a creation. If you create something and you can retrace the steps of that process, you can go backwards and see how it happened. That's called Yesh Me'esh, creating one thing from another thing, because there's a gradualism, there's a slowness. But if one thing was created from another thing, and you can't trace the steps back, you can't see how you went from point A to point B, you can't go backwards from point B to point A, that's called Yesh Me'ayin. So Yesh Me'ayin it really doesn't mean something out of nothing. Yesh Me'ayin means that the correct translation of the words Yesh Me'ayin, and the Maimorim also tell this to us, is Davar Milai Davar. Yesh Me'ayin doesn't mean something out of nothing. Yesh Me'ayin means a thing out of a non-thing. First there was something which is called nothing. Now, there's no such thing as nothing. So the meaning of the word non-thing doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Non-thing means it doesn't exist the way the new thing exists. When Hashem creates from a non-thing into a thing, He's really creating from one thing into another thing, but He's creating it in a quantum way. He's creating it in a jump way. First it's ayin, then it's yesh. You can't retrace the steps. Anytime Hashem makes something from something other, and you can't retrace the steps, that becomes a model for yesh me'ayin. Anytime one thing is created from another thing, and you could retrace the steps, that's called yesh me'yesh. Okay, so for example, if I wanted to create from clay a pot, I have clay, I have a pot, and I can see the process. I can see the steps that are going to get me from raw, a ball of this clay, and then you put it into a certain shape, and then you put it into a kiln, and then you bake it, and then you paint it, and then you bake it again, and then you zets it. You could trace the steps back. That's called yesh me'yesh, something from something. But for example, Hashem creates clay from words. He doesn't create it from nothing, because there's no such thing as nothing, not even my head. Hashem creates physical clay from His words. The process by which the words of Hashem are words of God to a physical piece of clay are quantum separated. That means to say it doesn't happen slowly, it doesn't happen incrementally. So when you look at the physical clay, you cannot see how it comes from Hashem. So we call it yesh me'ayin. We call it something from nothing, even though it's not really something from nothing, it's something from something else. But the one thing from the other thing are so far separated that as far as we're concerned, it's something from nothing. Okay, breathe. Did you understand what I said? Now there are two of you. Meir said this is very familiar. You came on a day that we're going over old stuff. Melly, you got it?
Yeah.
You got it. Okay, now. So one of the many mashals, one of the many different mishalim for the difference between yesh me'yesh and yesh me'ayin, which means something from something, where you can trace the steps backwards, and something from nothing, which doesn't mean from nothing, because there's no such thing as nothing, but something from a nothing where you can't retrace the steps, is the difference between a person who's walking and a person who's jumping. If you make 1,000,000 steps, which is an awful lot of steps, and it'll take an awful lot of time, your foot never left the earth. Never, not for a second. Because when a person walks, they always have one foot on the ground and one foot in the air. When you leap, both of your feet left the ground. Now, you stay suspended in the air for a second, or for a second and a half, or for 2 seconds. I don't know how good your leap ability is, and you land. But when you leave the ground, you lost any association with the old earth. And when you land, you are philosophically, you are virtually, conceptually landing on the new earth. So you're separated from who you were before. So walking would be step by step, yesh me'yesh. I can see how it went from point A to B. And a leap, jumping, would be quantum separated transition. I was here, I'm here, in the middle there's an interruption, and I can't see the gradualism, I can't see the step by step of this, okay? Now, think about this. You know what's an example of yesh me'ayin and yesh me'yesh? An example. It's only an example. You know what's an example of yesh me'ayin and yesh me'yesh? Reproduction. A baby is born. How is a baby born? They're conceived. Right? To conceive a baby, you have to have a dchad and a nukva, a male and a female, right? You studied biology, there's 42 chromosomes. They give you the example of a zipper, right? Remember that example from the zipper? That you take 20 chromosomes from the father and 20 chromosomes from the mother, and if they have to fit together perfectly so that the child should be healthy, and you have one cell, and then that cell becomes floating around in the rechem, and then it begins to multiply, becomes 2 cells, and then 4 cells, and then 8 cells, and then 16 cells, and then 32, and then 64, 128, and so on. And after a few days, it implants. It attaches itself to the rechem, to the it's called the placenta and the amniotic sac, and it begins to nurse off its mother. So Chassidus would say this: the moment of conception is like yesh me'ayin. Before there's no baby. There's a man, the father, there's a zochar, and there's an nekeva. 2 people, 2 creations. All of a sudden there's 3. Now that 3rd being is tiny. It's infinitesimally small. It's microscopically small. You can only see it with a microscope. And it's a new being. A second before it was half male and half female, and now it's in a new state. Then that point is going to multiply. That multiplication you can explain. That multiplication you can watch happen. And you can retrace the steps. You can see first there was 1 cell, and there were 2. You see the 1 cell split in half, and you have 2 cells. And the 2 cells split in half, and you have 4 cells. And the 4 cells split in half, and you have 8 cells. And 8 cells, and so on and so forth. And you can see the process. So once we accept as a philosophical foundation that yesh me'ayin doesn't mean something from nothing. It means something from a non-thing. Or more precisely, something from something else with a quantum separation, where you went from A to B without passing by A and a half. The moment of conception, the moment that the egg is fertilized and is not anymore a piece of mother, it becomes an entity unto itself. That's yesh me'ayin. It's a mushal. It's only a mushal. But it illustrates the idea that a minute before it was half male and half female, and now it's not the male, it's not the female, it's a 3rd entity. Everything that's going to happen after that, all the subsequent steps, it's going to divide into 2, and it's going to divide into 4, and it's going to divide into 8. All those steps, that's yesh me'yesh. In other words, Meli, every time a baby is born, there's a yesh me'ayin, there's a magic, there's a miracle. Father is a being, a mother is a being, a baby is a new creation. Now that new creation is going to get bigger and bigger. It's going to develop for 9 months in utero, 9 months in the rechem ha'em. Then the baby's going to be born, and the baby's going to eat, and the baby's going to drink, and the baby's going to breathe air, and the baby's going to do all kinds of other things. They can get bigger and bigger and bigger. They're going to become a person unto themselves. They're going to grow up. They're going to become an adult, and then they'll have children. The moment from before to after conception, a minute before there was no 3rd being, a moment after there is a 3rd being, that's a mashal for yesh me'ayin. Why? Because it's a miracle. A second before, there's a zochar and a nekeva. And in a second after, there's fertilized egg. The moment of fertilization is a nes. The Chassidus actually calls it a miracle, but I don't want to get into that aspect of it because it's not for this morning. The point is, that moment where what was before 2 now becomes 3, even though the 3rd is so small, that's a quantum moment. It's like something from nothing. It's not from nothing. It's from a father and a mother. But the miracle of that process, that a minute before it was zochar and a nekeva, and now you have zochar and a nekeva plus baby, that's a mashal for yesh me'ayin. Every single step in the development of that baby after that is only yesh me'ayin. Is gradual. Because you could understand it, and you could explain it, and you could trace it backwards, and you could predict it forward, and so on and so forth. There's so much data available that helps us understand the development of a fetus, and then the development of a child, and the development of a person. But the moment of conception, from before conception to after conception, this is a mushal. It's only a mushal for yesh me'ayin. Because before it was father and mother, then it's father, mother, and baby, and it jumped. Boom. Before you had two, now you have three. Even though the third is so small, and it came half from the father and it came half from the mother, the identifying of that third is not 50% father and 50% mother, but baby is yesh me'ayin. It's a mushal. It's an illustration. Okay? So now, what we just talked about, Meli and Mejev, is a classic concept in Hasidus. Any person who's learned Hasidus knows that there's two types of creation. Yesh me'ayin and yesh me'yesh. Yesh me'ayin simply means something from nothing. Yesh me'yesh simply means something from something else. But we now know that it's not that simple. Yesh me'ayin does not mean something from nothing. Yesh me'ayin also means something from something else. So if yesh me'ayin means something from something else, and yesh me'yesh means something from something else, what's the difference between the two models? The difference between the two models is yesh me'yesh is something from something else where I can see how it happened. Yesh me'ayin means something from something else where I cannot see it happen. And because I cannot see how it happened, we say that it's davar midlei davar. First there was nothing, now there is something, and it was a jump. Here comes the tough question. Did you understand?
I think so.
Okay, and I trust you. I trust you 100%. Now, I'm finishing the class with a point. And I understand that I haven't yet decided whether I'm actually going to read from 240, 241, 242 till the bottom of the page is this long lecture on yesh me'ayin. I may just read it, tell it to my heart, and then continue them. I want to teach you davening. I don't want to teach you philosophy. So the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek has a big discussion on yesh me'ayin. I may just jump over it. Okay. Here's the point of this entire conversation. If yesh me'ayin meant creating something from nothing, you can only do it once. If first there's nothing and then there's something, there's only one time nothing. You don't have nothing times two. But since we now know that yesh me'ayin doesn't mean something from nothing, it means something from something. And it's only called yesh me'ayin because the yesh is quantum separated from the ayin. The new creation is quantum removed from the old. This allows for what's called sequential yesh me'ayin. It can happen over and over again. Yesh me'ayin doesn't have to happen only once. Hashem creates the world from nothing. That can happen only once. Hashem creates from a non-thing into a thing. That can happen 1,000 times. You know why? Because non-thing to thing could be relative. For example, if I create from an idea, a rock, if I create from an idea, something in my brain, a physical stone, that's yesh me'ayin. You know why it's yesh me'ayin? Because ideas don't become rocks slowly. You take an idea and you dumb it down, and you dumb it down, and you dumb it down. It's never going to become a rock. It's a leap. Yeah. And the same is true if I create from Ein Sof an idea. If you're gonna dumb down Ein Sof 1,000 times, it's never going to become an idea, because Ein Sof means infinite and ideas are finite. So the purpose of this entire lecture, the entire conversation, as far as this Bible is concerned, is I'm talking now for about 37, 38 minutes. I'm talking a long time. It's a long class, longer than most of our classes, yes? The point of everything we learned is, number one, yesh me'ayin doesn't mean something from nothing, because there's no such thing as nothing. Yesh me'ayin means something from something else. So why do we call it ayin and yesh if it's something from something else? Because they're quantum separated. And when the source and the manifest are quantum separated, we relatively, that's the bad word, call this nothing and this something. Our Maimon is going to assert that you can do this over and over again. For example, you have grandparents, right? Your grandparents were created from their parents, from your great-grandparents. Your great-grandparents were a father and a mother, yeah? Yesh and yesh. And all of a sudden there was three. That's yesh me'ayin. That point That initial being multiplied, it became a baby, and then it was born, and then it grew up, and then it went to school, and then whatever it is. Then it got married, and the process repeated itself. Right? There were two, and then there were three. And then that third thing grew and grew and grew and grew, became a baby, and then it was born, and then it grew up, and then it got married. So every generation is a mushal for another step of Yesh Me'ayin. Cain and Hevel and Shes came from Adam and Chava, Yesh Me'ayin. It's only a mushal. Shes' son Enish came from Shes, Yesh Me'ayin. Enish's son Canaan came from Enish, Yesh Me'ayin. Why? If Yesh Me'ayin meant something from nothing, it can only happen once. First there's nothing, then there's something, and that's it. But since Yesh Me'ayin doesn't mean something from nothing, Yesh Me'ayin means something from something else. Just like Yesh Me'yesh means something from something else. But in the case of Yesh Me'yesh, one thing from another, you can trace the steps back and see how it happened. And in the case of Yesh Me'ayin, you cannot trace the steps back and see how one thing came from the other. So once you understand that Yesh Me'ayin doesn't mean something from nothing, it simply means something from something else that is quantum removed, you can have many Yesh Me'ayins. For example, you're a big Kabbalist, right? Everyone's a Kabbalist. You know why everyone's a Kabbalist? Because if nobody knows any Kabbalah, everyone's an expert. One guy finds out what Kabbalah is and he ruins it for the rest of them. But in the meantime, since nobody knows anything, we're all experts. There's a world called Asiya. It was created from Yetzirah, Yesh Me'ayin. There's a world called Yetzirah. It was created from the world called Bria, Yesh Me'ayin. There's a world called Bria. It was created from the world of Atzilus, Yesh Me'ayin. There's a world called Atzilus. It was created from the world of Ein Seif, Yesh Me'ayin. What does that mean? The Ein Seif world to Atzilus is quantum separated. To go from Ein Seif to Atzilus, you have to jump. To go from Atzilus to Bria, you have to jump. To go from Bria to Yetzirah, you have to jump. To go from Yetzirah to Asiyah, you have to jump. To go from a spiritual Asiyah to a physical Asiyah, you have to jump. So these are quantum moments, quantum points in time or in Hishtalshalos. Any quantum point is a Yesh Me'ayin point. So there can be many Yesh Me'ayins. As long as we accept that Yesh Me'ayin doesn't mean something from nothing. It means a thing from a non-thing. It means A becoming B without becoming A and a half in between. No intermediate forms. Jumps. That's a mashal for Yesh Me'ayin. Are we clear? I think I was clear. In my humble opinion. I'm a very humble man, you know that. I'm a very humble man. Huh? Meir Zev, that was clear.
Yeah, I'm not going to try and criticize you.
Huh? I'm very sensitive. Okay, listen. There's no shir tomorrow. I was supposed to take off today, and my children decided to don't ask. Whatever it is. I love my kids, and they wanted to do a trip, and then the trip had to be changed. So Sunday morning, we'll continue this conversation. I reserve the right to skip from 340 to make a quantum jump till the middle of 342, just to overview everything that's going on, because I want to talk about Krishma, not about Yesh Me'ayin. I will see you then. Have a good Shabbos. Melly, thank you so much for being there and for listening. Okay. Chazak Ramatz, good morning to all of you.